A high school teacher mocks a black student, calling her unworthy of success, not knowing that years later she'll be begging that same student for a job. Stay tuned to see how karma catches up and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It was a crisp morning in Atlanta, Georgia. As the high school buzzed with energy, students rushed to their classrooms, clutching books and chatting about everything from weekend plans to homework. For one student, however, the day wasn't starting with laughter or ease. Mia Johnson, a bright 17-year-old senior, walked into her English classroom with her usual calm demeanor. She wore her natural curls pulled back neatly and carried herself with a quiet confidence that often made her classmates look up to her. Mia was the type of student who always came prepared, answered questions thoughtfully, and aimed to make something of herself. But her teacher, Mrs. Deborah Harding, didn't see her that way. To Mrs. Harding, Mia was just another face in her class, a face she had already judged before Mia ever said a word. Mrs. Harding had been teaching at the school for nearly 20 years, but her reputation was far from stellar. Known for her sharp tongue and cold attitude, she was respected by some but feared by most, and while she prided herself on being strict but fair, her actions often told a different story, especially when it came to students like Mia. That morning, as the class settled in, Mrs. Harding passed out graded essays. She walked down the rows, handing back papers without much thought until she got to Mia. Holding the paper in her hand, she paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Well, Mia," Mrs. Harding said loudly, making sure the entire class could hear, "it seems like you've hit your ceiling." The room fell silent. Mia looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with surprise. Mrs. Harding smirked. "This essay," she said, waving the paper slightly, "it's average, at best. I've told you before, writing takes real talent, and frankly, not everyone has it. Some people just aren't cut out for certain paths." A few students exchanged uneasy glances. Some stared at their desks, unsure of what to do. Mia, however, didn't lower her gaze. "I worked really hard on that essay," she said firmly. "If there's something I need to improve, I'd appreciate constructive feedback." Mrs. Harding's smirk disappeared, replaced by a cold glare. "Constructive feedback?" she repeated mockingly. "Let me save you the trouble. Some people can try as hard as they want, but it doesn't mean they'll ever be good enough. You need to be realistic, Mia. College? A big career? Maybe aim for something more your level." Mia's chest tightened. Her fingers curled into fists beneath her desk. The words stung, but this wasn't the first time Mrs. Harding had belittled her. Still, hearing it out loud, in front of her peers, was something else entirely. "Thank you for your opinion," Mia said, keeping her voice calm even as her anger simmered. "But I think I'll decide what my level is." Mrs. Harding scoffed. "Suit yourself," she said, dropping Mia's paper onto her desk. "But don't say I didn't warn you." As the day went on, Mia couldn't shake the feeling of frustration and determination bubbling inside her. She had always known Mrs. Harding didn't believe in her, but today had crossed a line. Instead of letting the teacher's words drag her down, Mia made a silent promise to herself. One day, she'd prove Mrs. Harding wrong. Little did Mrs. Harding know, that day would come much sooner than anyone expected. Mia never let Mrs. Harding's words stop her. If anything, they fueled her determination. She poured herself into her studies, not just in English, but in every subject. While other students might have skipped assignments or coasted through senior year, Mia treated every paper, every project, and every challenge as a stepping stone. By graduation, she had earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university, and though she walked across the stage with a proud smile, Mrs. Harding didn't even look at her as she handed over the diploma. To Mia, that moment wasn't worth dwelling on. She had her sights set far beyond high school. Fast forward 10 years, and Mia's life looked drastically different. After graduating at the top of her class in college and earning a master's degree, she climbed the corporate ladder at a major publishing house. By 28, she was named the youngest editor-in-chief in the company's history. It wasn't just a job. It was the kind of role Mia had dreamed of as a teenager. Now, she was in charge of making decisions, publishing books, and mentoring young writers, especially those who came from underrepresented backgrounds. Every day, she worked to uplift voices that others might overlook. One afternoon, Mia's assistant stepped into her office, holding a resume. "There's a candidate here for the senior editing position," he said, handing it over. "They're in the lobby now. Pretty extensive experience." Mia took the resume and scanned it quickly. The name at the top made her freeze for just a moment. Deborah Harding. The name was too familiar. Could it really be the same Mrs. Harding? The woman who had once told Mia she wasn't good enough for success? Her assistant broke her thoughts. "Should I send her in?" Mia composed herself and nodded. "Yes, please." Moments later the door opened, and in walked Mrs. Harding. Time had aged her, but the sharp demeanor was the same. She smiled stiffly, clearly eager to make a good impression. She didn't seem to recognize Mia, yet. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Mrs. Harding said, her voice polite but slightly formal. Mia motioned for her to sit down, her own expression neutral. "Of course. I'm always interested in strong candidates," she replied, keeping her tone professional. As they began discussing Mrs. Harding's qualifications, Mia couldn't help but feel a strange sense of irony. Here was the woman who had dismissed her dreams all those years ago, now asking for a job at the company Mia ran. Finally, after a few minutes, Mia leaned back in her chair. "Your experience is impressive," she said. "It's clear you've spent a lot of time teaching and mentoring." Mrs. Harding nodded eagerly. "I've dedicated my life to education," she said. "Helping others achieve their potential has always been my passion." Mia raised an eyebrow, amused by the irony. She decided it was time to drop the facade. "Mrs. Harding," she said, her tone shifting slightly. At the sound of her name, Mrs. Harding froze, a flicker of recognition flashing in her eyes. "You probably don't remember me," Mia continued, "but I was one of your students, senior year, English class." The color drained from Mrs. Harding's face. She stared at Mia, struggling to piece together the memory, and then it hit her. "Mia Johnson?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia smiled faintly. "That's right, Mrs. Harding sat back, clearly stunned. "I had no idea," she stammered. "You've done so well for yourself." Mia didn't respond right away. She let the weight of the moment sink in before speaking again. "I have," she said simply, "despite what some people thought I was capable of." Mrs. Harding opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, the usually confident teacher looked uncertain, even humbled. Mia leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but firm. "You once told me I wasn't cut out for success, that I should aim lower. I remember every word you said, and I've carried them with me, not as truth, but as motivation to prove you wrong." Mrs. Harding looked down at her hands, her confidence completely gone. "Mia, I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I was wrong. I see that now." Mia nodded, accepting the apology, but not letting the moment slip away. "It's not about me anymore," she said. "It's about how many other students you might have discouraged, how many dreams you might have crushed with your words." There was a long pause. Then Mia stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "Thank you for coming in," she said. "We'll be in touch." Mrs. Harding stood as well, her face pale and her expression unreadable. She walked to the door, hesitating for a moment before leaving. As the door closed behind her, Mia sat back in her chair, feeling a mix of emotions. She didn't know if Mrs. Harding would reflect on this moment or if she'd truly change. But for Mia, it was enough to know that she had risen above the limits others tried to place on her, and that she was now in a position to inspire others to do the same. And just maybe, Mrs. Harding had learned a lesson she should have taught all along.